Ataque inminente.
Imminent attack. The United States and Israel are about to launch a new military strike against Iran. According to major Western media outlets, the attack has already been decided by US President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. However, this time, Iran's response could trigger a war with unpredictable consequences and even a possible nuclear reaction from Israel. Maximum tension in the Middle East. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning.
Buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días. Desde Berlín, Alemania, comenzamos la transmisión número...
From Berlin, Germany, we begin broadcast number 320 of Demolishing Myths Talks, completely live. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and to join us on our Patreon channel, launched just 2 weeks ago, and already with more than 1,000 subscribers. On the other side of the screen, and on the other side of the European continent, from Madrid, Spain, we're joined by Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, my friend, how's everything over there?
Fernando Moragón. Fernando, querido, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bueno, vamos aquí tirando, en estos...
Well, we're getting by. In this winter chill, which isn't really cold, but for me, anything below 25 degrees is cold. Anyway, we're getting by. We don't have any little rats yet. We're still waiting. I mean, it'll happen eventually. I guess we don't want to fall behind the Germans. And well, as you rightly point out, unfortunately, in that spectacular start to the year we've had, remember, I'm very repetitive, everyone knows that. 2026 was going to be worse, or will be worse than 2025, and so on and so forth. Well, there you have it. And waiting, well, for what everyone takes for granted. I mean, even the most skeptical person, even the most optimistic of optimists in the whole wide world is aware, acknowledges that there's going to be a war between the United States and Israel on one side, and Iran, the second part of the 12-day war. The only question is whether it's going to happen right now, today, tomorrow, this weekend, or if what they're doing now is just for show, while they prepare the real attack for a not-so-distant future. That's what we're discussing. But that there's going to be a war, that's clear. We're all absolutely sure of that.
La pregunta por el cuándo, no por el...
The question is about when, not if, right? No, exactly. The question isn't whether an attack will begin, but when it will begin. Now then, Fernando, before presenting the signs of an imminent attack, why do the United States and Israel feel the need to strike Iran again? Why this, no matter what? Could you give a brief summary of why this obsession with Iran?
Hombre, hay muchas razones, muchísimas. La principal, no olvidemos una cosa.
Man, there are many reasons, tons of them. The main one, let's not forget something. Trump, with his rhetoric and his constant bluster, that man never rests. Well, he often leaves us a bit dazed and all that. But let's not forget that what we're seeing with Trump is a different phase of American imperialism, meaning a different strategy from Biden's. Biden focused, or the Democrats did, because Obama did it too, mainly on attacking the Russians to weaken the Chinese. And I'll explain this very quickly. Look, it's been an objective in itself since the disappearance of the Soviet Union. But let's not forget that neither Russia, nor Iran, nor any other country is going to take the position of global hegemon away from the United States. The one that's going to take it, the one that's already taking it, is China. The ultimate goal is always China. I use a phrase that we often say here because of the old Roman Empire and the importance Rome has always had. There's a famous saying that goes, all roads lead to Rome. Well, I say all roads lead to China now. In other words, it doesn't matter which one you take. So China, like everyone else, has strengths and weaknesses. Right now, there's that magic triangle, as I call it, that controls Asia. It's Russia from Europe, that is, from European Russia, Belarus, and so on, all the way to North Korea. It dominates practically all of northern Eurasia, but especially Asia. Then we have China, which more or less controls Southeast Asia, or at least has the capacity to intervene in Southeast Asia. It could also carry out interventions in South Asia, but right now, since relations with India are good, there are basically no problems there. And then we have Iran, which controls the intermediate zone. In fact, it must be said that, of course, we can say this now with the benefit of hindsight, seeing what has happened. Surely the greatest defeat of the United States, considering what followed throughout the Cold War, was not Vietnam. Not by a long shot, it was the loss of Iran. Iran controls the Middle East, plain and simple. That is, losing an Iran that was in the hands of the Shah, who was an unshakable ally of the United States, was a disaster. In fact, and this is more or less well known, the move by the CIA and also the British in the face of a crowd, because when the Shah of Persia was overthrown, there were a lot of groups, among them the communists, who were very strong. And well, let's call things as they are. Ayatollah Khomeini wasn't in exile, I don't know, in the Soviet Union. He was in exile in France, which wasn't exactly anti-Western. I mean, what's more or less clear is that they preferred an Islamic revolution to a somewhat communist-leaning Iran and supported Ayatollah Khomeini. Then it backfired on them, as often happens with the United States, and they found themselves facing people who were fiercely anti-American. But anyway, as I was saying, control the Middle East. That is, if you want to do something, if you want to hurt China, you have to control Iran. Why? Because Iran, aside from holding the key to the Strait of Hormuz, can close it whenever it wants. And it's one of China's major oil suppliers. Let's not forget. That is, Chinese investments in Iran are very strong. They signed an agreement a few years ago, for 25 years, in which the Chinese committed, in exchange for a series of concessions from the Iranians, to invest $400 billion in Iran. In other words, Iran is key. You look at a map and it's immediately clear. The fall of Iran would be a disaster for both Russia and China, and it would finally remove Israel's great enemy. Also for the United States, but especially for Israel. So Iran is key, and it's also the weak side because both Russia and China are nuclear powers. Iran is not. You can go after Iran. With China and Russia, you can get involved indirectly, but not directly. Here you can, because there's no danger of... Well, there are other dangers, right? There are dangers. But anyway, this would have to be looked at. It's more complicated. I'm not an expert either, but a strong intervention in Iran would cause a serious oil disaster that would affect China. Careful, because all the oil, not just from Iran, but from the entire Middle East, would have a hard time reaching China. Besides, that would drive up oil prices. We'd have to see for how long, and would this benefit the United States or not? Well, partly yes, partly no. If oil prices go up, we'd have to see how much they rise, but it would favor greater profitability for hydraulic fracturing oil fields, for example, in the United States. But there are consequences. Unless they subsidize it or do something along those lines, the bill would ultimately be paid by the oil consumer. That is, the person who owns a car and has to fill it up with gas. And this is a taboo subject in the United States. In the US, you can do whatever you want. You can mistreat Americans however you like. But you can't raise the price of gasoline because they'll revolt and you'll lose the elections by a landslide.
Fernando, recapitulo los puntos más
Fernando, let me recap the most important points of your analysis. Why do the United States and Israel want to start an attack against Iran again? On one hand, you raise the issue of the blatant imperialism of the United States since Donald Trump came to power, right? Attacks everywhere. Venezuela, Iran, Greenland.
The thing about Greenland is going to be something funny, really amusing.
Secondly, the issue of the global confrontation between the United States and China through Iran. They would be acting against China, one of their main suppliers and a strategic partner in the region, as well as a partner of Russia. Thirdly, the control of the Middle East, by controlling at least the most unruly country in the region, if not the only unruly one, at least the most unruly of all. Fourthly, you raise the issue of Israel, the fact that Iran is the center of opposition to the State of Israel through its multiple allies in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, until recently in Iraq, and so on. And maybe you didn't bring it up, but I remember that on other occasions you did mention the imminence of the midterm elections in the United States, which creates a sense of urgency for that country, or, more specifically, for President Trump, because it's very likely that in those elections, Trump's party, the Republican Party, will lose its parliamentary majority in both chambers of Congress, and therefore will no longer be able to determine US foreign policy as freely as it does now, with control of both chambers. This also creates pressure, and he needs a victory.
Claro, y necesita triunfo. Sí, no. Y mira, ahora recordaba también otra cosa añadida. Y es que
Now he also remembered something else. And that is, look, one of the things Trump has said many times, he said it during the campaign and then repeated it again as president, is, don't touch the dollar. The dollar is sacred. Don't touch it. In fact, look, one of the things people are saying out there is that after Maduro's kidnapping and all that, they're commenting, well, now we're going to kick the Chinese out of Venezuela. And then they say, well, maybe we won't kick them out. We'll let them keep exploiting this and spend their own money on developing, or rather, putting into operation, which isn't the same thing. For example, the Orinoco Belt and all that. But of course, with one condition, that they pay in dollars.
Con una condición, que lo paguen en dólares. Es decir, no en yuanes, como se iba a hacer.
That is, not in yuan as it was going to be done, or as it was being done. This could also be one thing. We get involved with Iran, and in the end, the main concession you have to give us, that you have to make, is that from now on it will once again be in dollars, not in yuan. And this could also be extended to other countries like Saudi Arabia, which already has part of the oil it sells to China being paid for by China, well, by the Chinese, in yuan.
Vamos, lo están pagando los chinos en yuanes. Es decir, esta es otra.
That is to say, this is another one. The issue of the dollar, without a doubt, represents one of the dimensions of the struggle for global hegemony. US hegemony rests on multiple pillars, and the dollar is one of them. The dollar as a reserve currency, the dollar as the currency used for trading basic energy commodities like oil. That is disappearing because oil-producing countries, such as Venezuela, Iran, or Saudi Arabia, are beginning to trade their oil in other currencies, especially in yuan, with China. And the United States wants to re-establish the primacy of the dollar within the context of its rivalry with China. Well then, Fernando, let's now present the concrete signs of an imminent attack.
Vamos allá.
Perdón, de un ataque inminente. Comencemos por la propia prensa estadounidense.
Let's start with the US press itself, the Washington Post, just a few hours ago. The United States withdraws some forces from the Middle East as Trump considers attacking Iran. The Pentagon has begun pulling troops and equipment from the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, echoing the measures taken before the US attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities in June. Let's recall, the last time, before the attacks indeed, the United States began withdrawing its troops from the Al Udeid military base in Qatar as a precaution against a possible Iranian retaliation. This is the current situation, withdrawal of US troops from that location. What else?
Estadounidenses de ese lugar. ¿Qué más? Por acá, Reuters, Estados Unidos, medio estadounidense.
Here, Reuters, a US outlet, once again. Now in Spanish, Iran warns of retaliation if Trump attacks. The United States withdraws part of its personnel from its bases. The same information. All signs indicate that a US attack is imminent, says a Western military official. The United States is withdrawing part of its personnel from bases in the Middle East, as a precautionary measure. The Israeli assessment foresees US intervention, although the timing and scope remain unclear. Iran's security apparatus remains under control. According to a Western official, the protests have posed the greatest challenge to Iranian authorities in years. Reuters, a US outlet.
Reuters, medio estadounidense. Ahora, autoridades estadounidenses, como por ejemplo,
Now, US authorities, such as this one here, an organization belonging to the Department of State, known as TravelGov. I don't recall the exact name of the institution responsible for issuing warnings to Americans traveling abroad, have just released the following a few hours ago. Iran. US citizens should leave Iran now. Consider departing overland to Turkey or Armenia if it is safe to do so. Protests in Iran continue to grow. Security measures remain tightened, with road closures, disruptions to public transportation, and internet blackouts.
Interrupciones del transporte público y los bloqueos de Internet. El gobierno iraní ha restringido el acceso a las redes móviles fijas y de Internet.
The Iranian government has restricted access to mobile, landline, and national internet networks. Airlines continue to limit and cancel flights to and from Iran. Several have suspended their services. More information is available at the US Embassy in Iran. This is also quite recent. The claim about increasing protests is false. The protests were deactivated. But here, logically, they not only present the announcement or the exit warning, but also keep stirring the hornet's nest little by little, to create a sense of crisis naturally. Well, more evidence. Caroline Leavitt, the White House spokesperson, said the following to the press yesterday.
Diciendo lo siguiente a la prensa. Atención.
Airstrikes off the table in Iran, and does he believe
Attention.
path to end the protest there without military action?
Señora Caroline Leavitt,
Ms. Caroline Leavitt, are attacks against Iran off the table or not yet?
están como una de o son una de las opciones consideradas por el
Or are they one of the options the president is considering?
Is always keeping all of his options on the table, and air
Bueno, si hay algo
Well, if there's one thing President Trump is good at, it's keeping all the options on the table.
strikes would be one of the many options that are on the table for the commander-in-chief.
y para el comandante en jefe Trump, los ataques son
And for Commander-in-Chief Trump, the attacks remain one of the possible options.
Quite differently from the messages the administration is receiving.
la opción
The diplomatic option is always the president's first choice, as he himself said yesterday at a press conference.
Privately, and I think the president has an interest in exploring those messages. However,
The president intends to explore the diplomatic route. However,
he's not afraid to use military options if and when he deems necessary. And
Pero también ha mostrado
But he has also shown that he is not afraid to use the military option if he deems it necessary.
bueno, un poquito para un
A
lado.
ver,
otro poquito para el
permíteme una
otro.
nota cómica.
Well, just a little to one side. Let me add a bit of humor to such a serious topic. Yesterday, our dear, much-admired Chancellor Merz made one of those statements he's known for, the kind that leaves us all dumbfounded. He said, "The Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, is effectively finished. I believe we are witnessing the last days and weeks of this regime. When a regime can only stay in power through violence, it has de facto reached its end." I'm not sure if he was talking about his own. Yes, the German regime. Yes, the German regime. But anyway, these are the kinds of things Merz says, and, well, he said this from India and all that. Pathetic, really.
A ver, esto lo ha dicho desde la India y tal, una cosa patética. Pero lo que sí estamos viendo, efectivamente, es decir,
But what we are indeed seeing is that, well, the Germans, Lufthansa, and so on have already said they're canceling flights and such things. There are many signs, we'll go over some of them in a moment, that indeed the Americans are going to do something. But this is in the coming days, today, tomorrow, the day after, over the weekend. The signs are contradictory. In what sense? We have many indications that something is going to happen, that the Israelis are deploying or redeploying, expanding the Iron Dome defense system, and so on. Okay, that could be a sign that the Saudis, Qataris, and Oman, just think about it, those three.
Y Oman, tú fíjate, que tres. Esto parece así, va, si son árabes. Sí, pero no. O sea, son árabes.
It goes like this,
Oman, un país
right? If they're Arabs. Yes, but no. I mean, they're Arabs, but each time, let's see, Oman, a neutral country that's never even, if I remember correctly, been part of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And that has been a great mediator between different sides. That is, it gets along well with the Iranians, for example. Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood, terrible, awful for someone like the Saudis, their enemies. The Wahhabism of the Saudis has historically clashed with the Muslim Brotherhood and vice versa. Well, Qatar has its reasons, because the main oil field it has is shared with Iran. It's the Fars field, and it's the largest in the world. So if this blows up, Qatar is done for. Moreover, Qatar has the main base, Al Udeid, often mispronounced, the main American base in the entire region where the headquarters, the central command for that whole area is located. We have, let's say, various reports claiming that it's being evacuated, that the Americans are leaving the base. Well, these three, as I said, each one very different from the others, are right now protesting and pulling every string with the United States to say, no, don't attack Iran. In other words, they've taken Iran's side for their own interests, obviously, not for any other reason. But still, don't attack, and so on, because they know it would be chaos. And then we have the Emiratis, who are now at odds with the Saudis, and they do support the Israelis and therefore the Americans. Just to give you an idea of the mess we've got over there. What other signs do we have? Well, many notifications from governments telling their diplomats to leave Iran or other countries in the region, given a foreseeable increase in hostilities and so on. We have to be very careful with what comes from the White House, because Trump says anything every day. Besides, he says one thing and then the opposite. Let's not forget, Trump lies a lot. That is to say, it's also a strategy when you want to cover up an operation. Trump is constantly saying, we're going to attack Iran, and so on, just as he was constantly saying we're going to attack Venezuela, and so forth. And another thing we have to keep in mind, which we also saw in Venezuela, is that it wasn't as if one day Trump just said, oh, I'm going to attack Venezuela, I got up on the wrong side of the bed, and I'm angry. No. One of the things he did before was, during several months of fleet and aviation deployment and so on, to make feints of attacks that weren't real attacks. That is, sending electronic warfare aircraft, having these others take off, special forces from the amphibious assault ship in Iowa doing who knows what, declaring this zone, this air region, issuing a notice and declaring that no one should fly here because something might happen. This is part of the deception. In other words, you make moves that aren't real until the real one comes. But that way you confuse your enemy, who doesn't know which one is the real one. This could also be part of that.
That is to say, feints. Here, Fernando, the Wall Street Journal confirming your analysis. Iran's Gulf rivals are warning the United States against an attack on Tehran. Saudi Arabia is leading the initiative to persuade Washington not to intervene. Well, and here, regarding Donald Trump himself, these were his words yesterday on his inimitable social network, Truth. Iranian patriots, keep protesting. Take control of your institutions. Remember the names of the killers and abusers. They will pay a high price. I have cancelled all meetings with Iranian officials until the senseless killing of protesters stops. Help is on the way. Miga, make Iran great again. Miga, like breadcrumbs, Fernando.
Indeed, let's see. I prefer the edible crumbs to Trump's.
But anyway, that said, when someone says something about the United States, he gets outraged over the attacks against himself, against the United States, over the interventions. Now he can, about anything, call for revolution in any country, for committing an invasion.
He can do whatever he wants. But the rest of us, we're already in the terminal phase of the empire when there's no longer time for masquerades or cover-ups. Now it's just, well, we attack, and that's it, nothing more. And on top of that, Trump's personality, which is absolutely egocentric and narcissistic, well, the United States is Trump from his point of view. But there's something important about those famous demonstrations that needs to be said. Trump keeps going on about how he's helping and all that, whatever, but anyway, I mean, these demonstrations, which have indeed been very significant, well, we need to clarify because there are several elements here. On one hand, most of the people protesting were doing so because of a dire economic situation. Now, we don't even know why their situation is so dire or why they're protesting. And then there's the group of Mossad agents, there are a lot of them, who didn't just protest, they started shooting, throwing Molotov cocktails and so on, trying to trigger a cycle of action and reaction. That is, they get into gunfights, kill police officers, they've killed quite a few and so on, and therefore the state responds with strong repression, which is what they want. So you keep killing people and setting mosques on fire and so on because there's been a bit of everything, so that the state in the end cracks down, and in doing so, as is very common, doesn't clearly distinguish between those protesting because they're paid by Mossad, who are Mossad agents, and those protesting because of the economic situation. This is straight out of the textbook, a textbook case, right? Well, we have to say let's start with those who were protesting about the economic situation. It's not the first time Iran has faced this. It's had many and very large ones for these political reasons. And why? Because in Iran the following circumstances exist. A country that's been under embargoes, blockades, all sorts of restrictions for countless years. That is, with sanctions of every kind and nature, kicked out of the SWIFT interbank system, the Interbank Information Exchange Network, which means it has a lot of economic problems, just like that. And on top of that, it's nothing new. It's been like this for many years. Well, let's see, the first sanctions were imposed right after the Islamic Revolution succeeded. That is, the yuan kept rising, and this has an impact. Then we also have to tell the whole story. Look, the economic management carried out by the current government and the previous ones has been terrible, given those circumstances. In fact, right now there's an economy minister who's one of those neoliberals, like the Chicago boys from the Chicago school, and he's made a series of moves that have been a disaster. In other words, economic management has been poor overall, not just under this government, but under the previous ones as well. And this, the blame, I mean, okay, these are very difficult circumstances, but if on top of that you make things worse, well, that's bad. Then we have another additional factor, and that is, look, there's a significant part of the population, especially in Tehran and in the big cities, that, let's be honest, I know this is going to be controversial, is fed up with the Iranian theocracy. And it's not that they're in favor of the United States or the Shah, well, the Shah's son and all that. No, that's nonsense, propaganda. I mean, no. But they're tired of a theocracy that imposes a bunch of things on them, like the whole headscarf issue and so on, with a morality police that has been brutal, let's be honest, really harsh, and they're sick and tired of that. So that's the next factor. And this is important. The elite that has ended up consolidating in Iran, although it includes all kinds of people, has at least two major characteristics. One is that it is extraordinarily corrupt, let's call it like it is. That is, the Revolutionary Guards, who are the ones controlling the economy in general, are a very special body, a very special military force. In Iran, we have two military bodies. The regular army, like every country has, and then the Revolutionary Guard, which is the one that really calls the shots and holds power. In other words, these people, through foundations, control a large part of the economy because they own companies. I mean, this is something that isn't normal elsewhere. They control a large part of the economy. And therefore, confessions, a series of things where there's a lot of corruption. One more thing to add, and this usually isn't mentioned either, is that there's a massive fifth column there. And not just the fifth column of Mossad agents who are provoking protests and such, stirring them up, or those who are infiltrated and know the locations of politicians, generals, and so on, making possible a decapitation, as we saw in the 12-day war, of a good part of the establishment. No, I mean there's more than that. There's a segment of the political, economic, and military elite, and so on, of the Revolutionary Guards that is pro-Western, though to a degree people can't even imagine. And I always bring up, because I remember it, the case of Khamenei's son, who was initially a candidate to succeed him, but who now apparently has been ruled out.
Era un candidato a sucederle, pero que ya aparentemente está descartado. ¿Por qué? Porque es un tipo que tiene inversiones en la City de Londres.
Why? Because he's a guy who has investments in the City of London. In other words, they're supposed to be enemies. Well, these people are eager to reconcile with the United States. We're talking about the son of the leader of the revolution. So we're not talking about just some random guy. All of this comes together so that these protests that have taken place, which originated in the bazaar, just so we're clear, is where medium-scale trade happens. Not the trade of Iran's big corporations, but rather that of the middle and upper middle classes. Well, that's where the protests began, due to, as I said, an economic policy that caused prices to skyrocket. In short, disastrous. And it spread.
Eso se ha extendido. ¿Por qué? Porque hay mucha gente que ya digo que todo esto, la corrupción.
Why? Because there are a lot of people who, as I said, all of this, the corruption, the issue of cultural and social repression. Look, we have to keep in mind that, for example, women, even though they have rights they wouldn't even dream of in countries like Saudi Arabia, go to university. And in fact, there are more female university students than male ones, but in separate classes. Also, they're still very much subject to their husbands from a legal standpoint, even though they can get divorced and things like that. In practice, things get very complicated. I mean, let's not forget that what they have there is a theocracy, and all these people have joined the protests. The protests, as I said, have now come to an end.
Las protestas, ya digo, ahora mismo ya han cesado. Las últimas protestas han sido de apoyo.
The latest protests have been in support of the regime and therefore have already ended. So that idea that help is on the way, well, it may be on the way, but it's arrived too late. The 7th Cavalry in this case hasn't shown up like in Hollywood movies, riding in at the last moment to defeat the Indians. No, here, if it arrives at all, it's arrived too late because the protests are no longer useful. In fact, what's been reported throughout these protests, which began in late December, is that both Israel and the United States have been monitoring them very closely and have been seriously considering direct intervention beyond what the Mossad, the CIA, and others were already doing.
Más allá de lo que estaba haciendo el Mossad, la CIA, etcétera, sobre todo el Mossad, es decir, intervenir más directamente.
Above all, the Mossad, that is, to intervene more directly, to take advantage of the protests to carry out actual military attacks, plain and simple. In the end, they didn't do it. If you want, we can get into, well, we can say one thing in advance. These protests are basically, as I said, they may be anti-Iranian regime, but they are not pro-United States. That needs to be made clear. Iranian nationalism is very strong, and someone can be an opponent and be against an internal opponent, not those in Washington, who are laughable. That is, an internal opponent of the policies being carried out by the current government or the ruling theocracy and so on. But what they are not in favor of is the United States bombing them, invading them, and provoking a regime change.
That's one of my points, Fernando. My Iranian friends, and I have several Iranian friends here, hold different positions regarding the regime. Some are in favor, some against, and some in between. However, at the time of the Israeli attacks, even the most critical of the Iranian regime reacted in line with the Iranian government, because for them, Iran's problems must be solved by Iranians themselves. Very, very nationalist in that sense. On the other hand, indeed, this regime represents a theocracy, a structure legitimized around God and a religious figure. Now, in the Middle Eastern context, from the second half of the 20th century onward, if not earlier, The options at this point generally appear to be between theocracies or monarchies.
Teocracias o monarquías por lo general. Teocracia como la iraní, monarquía, aunque una monarquía.
Theocracy, like Iran's, monarchy, although a theocratic monarchy as well, like in Saudi Arabia, and not much more than that. Because whenever the option of a third political regime appeared, in the form of nationalist democracies, such as the last democratic government in Iran, overthrown in 1953, the British and the Americans themselves decided to overthrow it, in order to establish either monarchies or theocracies aligned with their interests. Nationalist democratic governments always wanted one little thing, the nationalization of oil resources, and none of the great powers would ever accept that. So I agree with all the criticism of the theory. Yes, no, but what you're saying is also true for them.
Esto que dices es... esto que dices es muy importante.
Yes, no, what you're saying is... It's very important. I mean, because of course it seems like things just fall from the sky here, right? Well, no, it's very important. Why? Because, as you rightly said, there's a problem. Well, first, the case of Mossadegh, which, by the way, involves documents that have already been declassified. So this isn't... No, we have the documents. And the British and the Americans took down the regime, basically Mossadegh's democracy, and brought in the father of that one, imposed an anti-democratic monarchy. Let that be clear. Why? Because Mossadegh had the audacity to nationalize the oil. And of course that didn't sit well.
Y claro, esto como que no. Además hay que añadir a esto otra cosa muy importante.
Moreover, we must add something else that's very important and that has been sold to us, especially since the September 11 attacks, that in the Islamic world, everyone is a jihadist. No, absolutely not. In fact, those who have been promoting radical, intolerant Islamism, whether Wahhabi or other forms, that is, whether Al-Qaeda, which we already know was created by the United States, have been the United States itself, mainly since the 1970s. Let's not forget that when the war in Afghanistan took place, the United States supported, among the many groups wandering around there, the most disreputable of the disreputable.
Apoya a los más impresentables de los impresentables. Apoya a los equivalentes a los talibanes.
He supports the equivalents of the Taliban, the hardliners. He doesn't support the moderates, those he gets rid of. And what he does in the 70s is a double deal. Let's remember, the Saudi monarchy, absolutely uncompromising, brutal, where women are marginalized, right? And then, and many other things, where they cut off heads. Of course, it really makes me laugh, you know? People don't say it, but over there the death penalty means exactly that, cutting off heads. This year, I don't know how many they've executed, around 400 or so officially, beheading people for 1,001 reasons, right? Then they have such wonderful and extraordinary punishments as flogging, don't they? I remember the case of a poor YouTuber who was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. Of course, anyone, even Superman, would be killed by 1,000 lashes. You wouldn't make it to 1,000. What did they do? Well, ...
Puntos suspensivos. Distribuir esos latigazos a lo largo del tiempo.
To spread those lashings out over time, so as not to kill the guy. So they gave him 100 lashes a month, let him recover, and then another 100 lashes. Which is, let's say, very humanitarian of the Saudis. Very humanitarian, right? A thoughtful gesture on their part. Well, there are many others like that. But these ones in particular, let's not forget that when Nixon got rid of the gold standard, he said, I need to anchor this to something, otherwise we're in trouble. I'll anchor it to something that's essential for everyone, energy. And to what exactly? Coal? No, oil. And who was the main oil exporter at that time? The Saudis. Then we created the petrodollar and supported all the most radical, most Salafist, most jihadist movements we could find. And they have promoted jihadism everywhere. I mean, the pressure is more lenient. And I'll give a current example of the opposite so that people don't get the impression that all Muslims are fanatic jihadists who just want to behead Christians, which is what they're trying to sell us. And that example is Burkina Faso. In Burkina Faso, there's a government led by Ibrahim Traoré, a Muslim, because most of the population is Muslim, but there's also a significant Christian minority. Christians there have no problems. They're defended from the jihadists, and tolerance is absolute. In other words, watch out. This tolerant Islam is what the United States has made sure to destroy, or at least tried to destroy constantly everywhere, while supporting exactly the opposite. That's why we're in the situation we're in.
Even Pan-Arabism, Fernando, secular Pan-Arabism, for example, Hamas itself, created by Israel against the PLO and al-Fatah, which were Pan-Arabist and secular. Well, in another context, the US attack on the Afghan Communist Party through the funding of the Taliban in Afghanistan is another example. The attack against Saddam Hussein, against Baathism, both the Iraqi version under Saddam Hussein and the Assad regime. Not democratic, yes, but religiously tolerant. Attacked either directly by the United States or by Islamic groups funded by the United States. Everywhere, the existing regimes respond to the destabilization of any national and popular project in this region, overthrown by the United States, because those political projects seek control of resources for their own peoples, and the United States, and before it the United Kingdom, do not tolerate this in any way.
No convalidan esto de ninguna manera.
So that's why I say that, of course, in that sense, Iran is a break on American imperialism, previously British. The current Iran, is the thorn stuck in the empire's side in the Middle East. The big thorn, so to speak. So, from that point of view, there really is an anti-imperialist struggle, which in this case is represented by Iran. And as we were saying here about Venezuela, when people make those kinds of stupid arguments like that's not a democracy, well, to begin with, the West isn't exactly in a position right now to be handing out democracy certificates to some countries and not to others. We're not in that position, huh? We're not at our best right now. And if you don't believe it, just ask von der Leyen how she manipulates, rigs, and messes with elections, like in Romania. So we're not up for that. But there's also a basic, fundamental principle. We may like a country, whether it's democratic or not, whatever kind of regime it has, it doesn't matter. But it's about the principle of sovereignty, of respecting the sovereignty of nations. In other words, you can't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. That's something absolutely, unmistakably clear.
Fernando,
the mistake in the demand for democracy, in my view, is made by us, the ones who want democracy. But precisely because we're naive, because we're idealists. We often make demands of political movements without remembering the contexts in which those movements arise. The case of Venezuela is the clearest of all. Maduro's regime does not conform to the parameters of liberal democracy. Well, fine. But why not? Because I remember that the Chavista governments, without even a doubt about being undemocratic, were voted and revoted 70 million times, both Chavez and Maduro, up to the last election. I remember, against those governments, coups d'état, or as they call them, basically attempted uprisings in the streets, fomented from abroad, political and economic attacks, if not military ones, economic sanctions, exhaustion, external strangulation in every possible way, even through the seizure of oil tankers before the kidnappings, the seizure of Venezuelan gold in the United Kingdom, the freezing of monetary reserves in the United States, Citgo as well, the Venezuelan refinery and chain of gas stations in the United States. So in light of all that, when governments later respond to so much imperial imposition, sometimes in a harsh and authoritarian way, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not out of context. It's a reaction to a situation in which they find themselves harassed from all sides. The same goes for Cuba. And with this, they'll label me as, no, I don't describe Cuba as a liberal democracy in any way. But could Cuba establish a liberal democratic political system under a 60-year embargo? with the Bay of Pigs, with an attempted invasion. We sometimes expect too much from these political movements being strangled by the American eagle.
We have an example that everyone knows, but well, there are plenty. This idea that the United States and its European vassals stand for freedom, democracy, and human rights is pure rhetoric, constantly proven false. Take the example of Chile, a democracy, with all its imperfections, within that liberal framework, where when Allende was in power, some military officers like Pinochet organized a coup d'etat because democracy didn't suit them. Because, well, this business of nationalizing copper, no way. And they destroyed democracy. And what did they bring after democracy? A dictatorship. So it's never really been about whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship, but whether it's convenient or not. If it's convenient, it doesn't matter whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship. And if it's a dictatorship like Saudi Arabia's, they support it because it's convenient. And if it's a democracy that's not in their orbit, they destroy it.
Another comparable area, Fernando, and today our minds and beautiful souls will be machine-gunned, and will be machine-gunned by the promoters of liberal democracies, in line with the major media outlets. Putin in Russia, yes, with authoritarian elements, but beyond that, with 87% approval from Russian society. Real approval, but yes, regarding minorities, with authoritarian elements. Now, what are the real existing alternatives for Russia? Either Putin, with 87% support, and a sovereign policy that's very beneficial for Russia compared to the past 20 years, or the later Russia, the liberal democratic one that came after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a destroyed Russia, a subjugated Russia, a Russia under the yoke of imperial powers.
Una Rusia bajo el yugo de las potencias imperiales. Esas las alternativas reales. Entonces ahora vamos a
Those are the real alternatives. So now we're going to start with the rant about how Putin is bad with sexual minorities. Yes, Putin has a very conservative policy against sexual minorities. I don't support that policy. But look, what they've done is 87% of the Russian population, and besides, that's also the state of Russian political culture. Yes, but look, what you're saying is very interesting. From the Olympus. This is very difficult, of course, from the Olympus of democracy. Especially coming from them, the great promoters and dictators of the world.
Of course, what you're saying is very interesting because, let's see, look at the double standard used by liberal Western democracies. Which, by the way, right now Russia is absolutely comparable to what current liberal democracies are. That's why I say it's completely comparable for better and for worse. Anyway, we have Putin, who bans publications about homosexuality, etc. on the internet. Fine, you can be for or against that. I have gay Russian friends, and they've told me they never had any problems there. Sure, you couldn't hold pride parades, but there were plenty of venues, people went out, and they told me, we've practically never had any problems. In fact, a particular friend of mine told me, I've only ever had a problem with people who opposed homosexuality in a, let's say, violent way. But it didn't happen in Russia. It happened in Spain, and the violent ones were Germans. They went there to beat them up, basically. So anyway, but then you say, okay, but then we have the case of a historical ally, as we were saying, of the United States, where we all know homosexuality is highly respected, Saudi Arabia, where if they catch you, they cut off your head. And that's not a metaphor, it's literal. Homosexuality in Saudi Arabia is punishable by decapitation. But that's apparently fine, right?
Pero esto no pasa nada, ¿eh? El movimiento woke LGTBI HJK.
The LGTBI movement, I've never seen, at least in Spain, a demonstration in front of the Saudi Arabian embassy protesting against this. What a coincidence, damn, I don't know. And they sure have plenty of reasons to protest. Tons of them. That's why I say it seems there's a huge disproportion between being banned from publishing things on the internet, mainly aimed at children, not adults. which is what they banned, at least at first, and having your head cut off. There's a gap there, huh? But a big one, a really big one. Of course, this is hypocrisy, double standards, the double measure that the West always uses. And then, of course, people eventually say, no, look, don't try to sell me that story. And ultimately, it's been proven. That is, we can look back at history. Political changes, whatever direction they take, are either made by the citizens of the country where those changes occur, or if they're imposed from outside, they turn out to be a disaster for that population. A complete disaster. And in the case of the United States, I don't know a single country, I'd have to check. I can't recall a single one where a U.S. military intervention has brought about democracy. Not a single one. No, and with what right anyway? Well, but then you even say, come on, fine, they claim divine right, which is another thing, because since they're the chosen ones to rule the world and lead the planet, they assume the divine right to do whatever they please. You might say, well, at least they're spreading democracy and freedom around the world. It's the opposite. I mean, what are you talking about? No, they're spreading dictatorships, cutting back freedoms all over the world, starting with their own country.
Our own supremacism. I have no sympathy for countries where the Islamic veil is mandatory for women. I wouldn't want that. But by what right can I claim the supremacy of my values over a society that's 10,000 kilometers away from here? In Iran, let the Islamic veil be decided by the Iranians, or by Iranian women in any case. How is it that the United States wants the abolition of the Islamic veil in Iran or Kazakhstan? That's their business, folks. A textbook example.
Tenemos un ejemplo de libro. Tenemos un ejemplo de manual.
We have a textbook example. The Americans arrive in Afghanistan, invade it, and drive out the Taliban. Hardliners doesn't even begin to cover it. They were brutal. They draft a constitution, of course, more or less democratic liberal, with some concessions, but it's just a worthless piece of paper that was never actually implemented. It was approved, sure, but so what? Since society, at least especially the Pashtuns, who make up the majority of the population, but really society in general, is particularly strict as it already was before, well, in the end, after 20 years of American rule there, of NATO, let's not forget, because in the end, the entire NATO got involved. They managed, after holding supposedly democratic elections, calling them democratic is a joke. In a country that didn't even have an electoral census. But how are you going to hold elections where 80% of the population is illiterate? Do you think you can make the historical leap from a medieval society, which, okay, yes, uses Kalashnikovs and cell phones, but that's it? That is, from a medieval society to a postmodern woke one. You're out of your minds. So what happened? What happened was that during those 20 years of dominance, they were unable, through imposition, to change the society, because societies don't change by imposition, and they had 20 years, which isn't a short time. So what happened afterward? What happened in the end? Well, who succeeded the American dominance? The ones they overthrew, the Taliban. In other words, 20 years of war, tens or hundreds of thousands of deaths to drive out the Taliban, only for the Taliban to win again. Why? Because a very significant part of society supports this kind of strict interpretation of Islam, which, let's not forget, as we said before, was encouraged by the Americans in Pakistani madrasas during the fight against Afghanistan. So of course then you tell me, no, in the end it will be the Afghans who will have to evolve over time. You can, let's say, encourage that, but encourage it as the result of negotiation, not imposition. That is to say, you can already do what the Chinese are doing. Well, look, come on, ease up a bit on the oppression of women, let them study and all that. And We, since we're investing there and everything, well, try to moderate yourselves. Fine. That kind of transaction. I make a concession in exchange for you making another. But imposition is doomed to fail. It's societies themselves that have to evolve internally toward whatever it may be. Liberal democracy, communism. That's why China's success, of course.
Por eso el éxito de China, los chinos establecen vínculos económicos y políticos.
The Chinese establish economic and political ties with the whole world. Everyone has their own political issues, their own practices, their own matters. The Chinese also don't want anyone imposing on them. They have good relations with everyone, and thanks to that, they were able, for example, to restore relations between two mortal enemies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was the Chinese who made that happen. Thanks to you, invading everywhere, crushing everyone. And then from the pulpit, no, because they're not a democracy. Democracy? That democracy with Sleepy Joe, with Biden, like a senile puppet, with the deep state running things from above, or with the disgraceful Trump. Is that democracy? Is that the model? Or is the European Union under Ursula von der Leyen the model of democracy?
That's why I'm saying, Fernando, we're giving up. I'll just throw caution to the wind and say, all right, let's go.
I just heard some words from Trump yesterday about Iran, Fernando.
Oops, it froze.
Yeah, well, me too. Trump's frozen.
Trump has gotten hung up on the Greenland issue.
It froze. The same video, just a little longer. Well, the most important part of this statement, in a moment, with Trump saying the following. Here, Mr. President, do you commit to not sending US troops to Iran? And Trump replies, why would I tell you that? Why would I tell you? I don't discuss military strategy with a journalist, you know. Although I like the Financial Times, because it was a Financial Times journalist. And again, are you consulting with our allies about Iran? What are they telling you? And what do the Iranians think? And then Trump replies, well, I'm not going to tell you what they're telling us, but the military option is not off the table. That was yesterday, once again.
But look at the image. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. This man, who is he? The President of the United States, or just an ordinary guy from the US, going to watch a baseball game wearing a cap with... What is this? That already says it all, wearing a USA cap right there. He looks like a hooligan from American football or whatever. I mean, you picture a serious president traveling around the world without things like that.
That is, Putin wanted one too, huh?
For him. Yes, Putin and Xi Jinping wear one from China or Russia every day. Yes, and they hold press conferences. Well, that already tells you everything about what the United States is. I mean, this image says it all. But anyway, let's see. Another very typical Trump thing. The yes, but no. That is, no, we'll see what we do. I'm not going to tell you, but you'll see, huh? You'll see what we've got prepared, but I'm not telling you.
That, Fernando. This just a few minutes, nothing more.
Our representatives in Iran are telling us that the killings are stopping. The killings of civilians are stopping.
And there's no plan for executions or executions.
And there are no plans for executions at the moment. That's what I'm being told. I think it's a negative step. We're going to find out more about it. The usual back and forth before the attacks.
Let's see. Are they telling us that the executions are stopping? Or are they telling us that the executions are not stopping? What wickedness. He'll just make it up depending on what suits him, with total shamelessness. I mean, now it suits me to say there are no executions in Iran, even if there are. So I say there aren't. Now it suits me to say there are executions, even if there aren't. So I say there are. What difference does it make? This is constant with Trump, and he does it very brazenly. Well, they're telling me yes, there is. No, but wait, we're going to consult our European allies. The European allies are telling me no. Well, maybe we'll invade, or maybe we won't. You'll see. I keep hearing the same thing. Of course, it's also a strategy of confusion. That is, I say 1,000 contradictory things, and no one really knows what I'm doing or what I'm going to do. Because if I'm saying I'm going to invade Iran, and at the same time that I'm not going to invade it, then in the end, I'm not giving any information at all.
But this is very typical of Trump. Several very interesting things. These hard facts right now, pay attention to this. The Israeli presidential plane is leaving Israel, apparently on its way to Cyprus. A move typical of military operations in which Israel is involved. They never carry out these actions with Netanyahu in Israel, but rather when Netanyahu is abroad, obviously for security, distraction, or some other reason. This is the usual step before such actions. Another one here, Fernando, at the base in Qatar, specifically the Al Udeid Air Base.
Al Udeid mispronounced.
Al Udeid. Bien.
Al Udeid. All right, 6 Stratotanker aircraft. Yes, tankers. Exactly, these are the planes used for refueling. Generally, these Boeing KC-135 Stratotankers, aircraft used for aerial refueling. 6 planes in the air, loaded with fuel, apparently waiting to be deployed. Another sign, perhaps a diversionary maneuver, but before attacks, this situation always occurs as well. Sorry. And over here, just a little while ago, another of the air reports. An AWACS plane, down there, at the bottom, that blue line. An AWACS aircraft already in the air too, which is why there's no information, these planes are unregistered. But there, quite clearly, the Bombardier Global 6000, one of the aircraft used precisely for aerial and ground monitoring before attacks. These are the hard facts at this moment. Meanwhile, to my surprise, just after finishing this interview on Fox News a little while ago, crazy stuff, the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, on Fox News, talking with that reporter, one of those Fox News types you can't take seriously, with a message for Trump. Pay attention to his words in this interview. 1 second, Fernando, I'm going to adjust our heads a little higher.
No, mine. Let's see, I have a tendency to keep going downhill. In the end, one day I'll end up like that, and it's going to be, well, it just can't be.
Well, I remember one day, Fernando, that you, looking straight ahead, had information right up to the hairs on your nose. By the way, your nose was very clean. It surprised me.
Thank you very much. I try to maintain good hygiene. More specifically, yes, I try to keep up with nasal hygiene as best I can, but, well...
Well, a little bit of throat clearing there.
Is considering some kind of action to help.
If you have a message for President Trump, who is evidently considering some action to help the people protesting in Iran, do you have a message for him? What is it? My message is, don't repeat the same mistake you made in June.
If you try to repeat a failed experience, you'll get the same result.
If you try to repeat a failed experience once more, you'll get the same result.
In June, you destroyed the facilities, the machines.
You know, in June they did destroy the facilities and the machines. But technology cannot be bombed, and determination cannot be bombed either. Iran is ready for negotiation and diplomacy. We proved it many times in the past. We proved it in 2015. We proved it in 2020 through negotiations.
Every time. But it was the U.S. who always escaped from diplomacy.
But it was always the United States that escaped diplomacy.
And opted for war. My message.
They cut it off. The United States cut off diplomacy and chose war. My message then is
between war and diplomacy.
Between war and diplomacy is always the best option.
Have any positive experience from the United States?
Aunque no tenemos una experiencia positiva en este sentido con los Estados Unidos.
Although we don't have a positive experience in this regard with the United States, diplomacy is still better than war. Interesting. Fox News.
Interesante. Fox News.
Igualitas que las declaraciones del tipo de un tipo.
Just like the statements from a guy like Trump, who the other day, I suppose you must have seen it, was at some factory, I don't remember which one, visiting it, and an employee, a worker who was there, what did he say to him? He said, "Oh, let me think." He said something, and the guy responded by flipping him off. I don't know if you saw it.
No sé si lo visteis.
He called him a defender of pedophiles. That's what he called him. A defender of pedophiles because of Epstein. And good old Trump, with his thumb up.
Arriba, y cuentan que además le dijo algo así como...
Up. And they say he also told him something like, "Go to hell," but harsher. That's the difference between a guy who's a neighborhood bully and a diplomat who maintains a stance of saying, "Don't do what you're planning to do, because we will respond, as we did, but with greater force in the 12-day war. But we're open to dialogue. It's you who have sabotaged the talks and deceived us." That's why we have bad experiences, as the foreign minister says. I mean, he says it firmly, but properly, let's say. In other words, he's not out there flipping people off. I mean, when the Fox host asks him for a message to Trump, he doesn't go raising his finger. I'll raise another finger, okay? Not that one.
No sale sacando el dedito, voy a sacar otro dedo, ¿eh? Este no es. No sale sacando el dedito, mire, para Trump, este.
He doesn't just point his little finger and say, "Look, for Trump, this one, this one." I mean, these are already more than obvious differences. But I think Iran, well, the Iranian leaders have internalized, even though they try to prevent it, that the attack is going to happen, whether now or next month, but that inevitably there's a second part to the 12-day war. And, well, as you were saying, the signals are ambiguous. There are very clear ones, like the fact that Israel's presidential plane has gone to Cyprus. Whenever it goes to Cyprus, it's because there's been a major attack. So yes, they are abandoning the bases like those in Al Wade and others. The question is, what is Trump going to do? Well, in principle, the range of options is very broad. Is he going to carry out a real attack? And by real, I mean a hard one.
Real? Cuando digo real, duro? Or
is it going to be something symbolic, semi-arranged, like what happened with the attack on the Iranian nuclear program, where I attack the Iranian nuclear program, but I don't destroy it. Besides, I don't have the capability to do so. That famous bomb that supposedly, theoretically, can reach up to 60 meters deep. In practice, it depends on many factors and doesn't go beyond 20 at best. The GBU, I don't remember the name, 57, I think. But don't quote me on that. And then I'll let you speak. I evacuate the base in Qatar, the one in Al Udeid, and let you bomb at will, because I don't have anything important there. And everyone's happy. I say I've achieved a victory that ends the Iranian nuclear program, even if it's not true. Who cares? And the Iranians can say they've responded to American aggression. Is he going to do something like that or not?
Sí.
This is what we don't know. Yes, I'd like, as a final topic of discussion, Fernando, to talk about the possible consequences of this. But before that, you just mentioned the US responsibilities in the rise of extreme Islamism. And from that word, that term responsibility, I immediately remembered the following, dear Fernando. Let's see. Germany's historical responsibility in France, the war in Ukraine, and the current Eurasian geopolitical situation. And why did I remember this?
¿Y por qué recordé esto? Porque hoy mismo nuestro canal de Patreon...
Because today, on our Patreon channel, Moliendo Mitos on Patreon, we're presenting this incredible reaction, this spectacular analysis by Fernando and yours truly, to an interview given by the American economist Jeffrey Sachs, highly critical of the United States, to Professor Glenn Dixon about Germany's historical responsibilities in all of this. From there, we began an analysis, Fernando. Today we went back to around World War II.
No, and even more, I went back as far as German unification. That is what they've said here on this platform. 1871. 1871.
1871, yes.
Let's just say that, said on this platform, Germany has had an unfortunate political course since then. Look at that. How diplomatic. Said here, said here. On Patreon, I don't put it that way. I say it a bit more bluntly. Let's say yes, yes, yes. And there you can see how I refer to the Germanic world in general, to Germany in particular, to the Anglos. That is, let's not forget, because we tend to forget this, that England, well, the United Kingdom and the United States, as both heir and creation of the United Kingdom, are also Germanic. That is, anyone who speaks a Germanic language is Germanic, and English is a Germanic language. And I'll say no more or I'll get myself in trouble.
Three broadcasts so far, Fernando. The latest one, today's, is about German historical responsibility. We also previewed it on YouTube. The broadcast on Zionism and the first one on Russian nuclear doctrine with Sergei Karaganov. It's really amazing to be able to present all these topics there without holding back, Fernando. We're doing some outstanding analyses, responding to the work of the world's top experts. Don't miss out. Join us by subscribing on Patreon.
That's right. At least we can express ourselves more freely.
Indeed, the last one. In the event that something similar to the 12 days begins, wouldn't that situation present an extremely dangerous potential for escalation? If Iran were to respond with all its weapons, all its missiles against Israel, Israel found itself cornered and eventually responded with nuclear force.
Well, indeed, that's where we get into a real mess. Why? Because it's clear that if there's going to be a joint Israeli-American attack, the one who's really going to take the hits will be Israel. Because as we're seeing, the Americans are evacuating bases. Well, and in the worst-case scenario, they lose a base. If they have 800 around the world, worse things have happened to them. In other words, they'd have relatively few problems. The ones who were going to get hit from all sides, as we saw in the 12-day war, missiles coming from everywhere, were the Israelis. And as we've said many times, Israel is an indefensible country because it has no strategic depth, because it's very small, and because, as has been demonstrated, saturation systems, the Iron Dome, David's Sling, the Arrow, and all the American missiles, the Patriot, and so on, don't work to stop the missiles. Iran has been rearming since the 12-day war, mainly with weapons from China and Russia, preparing for this second round. The one that's going to take all the hits will be Israel. And let's not forget, by the fourth day of the 12-day war, Israel was already calling for a timeout and asking the Americans to step in somehow to save their skin. Then, on top of that, we'd have the fact that there wouldn't be separate wars. Let me explain. In this case, everything connected to the axis of resistance would get involved. Hezbollah would have no choice but to intervene. It's not that they're eager right now to fight the Israelis, but they wouldn't have any other option. That is, the Houthis, who are currently calmly watching how the Saudis have just massacred the proxies. Well, the Saudis' proxies have just massacred the Emiratis' proxies in Yemen, and were observing it as if watching it on TV, would have to respond by launching their missiles and so on, stirring up trouble again in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which already has plenty of trouble as it is. In other words, the chaos that would break out would be spectacular. Spectacular. And then you say, but what can the United States do that it hasn't already done? Everyone, I mean, even the dumbest of Trump's dumb advisors, rules out because it's unfeasible, a ground attack on Iran. That would be suicide, meaning a spectacular defeat for the United States. It's a country about 3 times the size of Spain with 90 million inhabitants. It's unfeasible. I mean, you can bomb, but what are you going to bomb? You've already, so to speak, taken out the Iranian nuclear program, which has since been reinforced, and new, deeper facilities have been built, and so on. That no longer sells. What are you going to bomb? The Iranian army, the National Guard. Yeah, well, but, and in exchange, are you going to have a destroyed Israel? I don't know. I mean, I don't see what the United States can do right now that would benefit it without harming Israel. That's the key. Because yes, if it weren't for the issue of Israel, if Israel didn't matter to them, maybe they wouldn't care, right? Trump, right? These things, Trump is a man of principles, meaning he has no principles. That is, he's pro-Zionist because it suits him, not because he believes in it. I mean, this guy, his principle is to win and make deals. That's it. And to build a resort in Gaza. That's his principle. So, of course, what he'd love is to cauterize, because they know the only thing they can do is cauterize. We have the case of Venezuela. Since the opposition was so disreputable, they said, no, better let the ones in power stay. We carry out this operation, both cosmetic, removing Maduro, kidnapping him, but we show our strength. But let those who are in power stay, because otherwise there's oil here, and with the opposition they're incapable of governing. Let those who are in power govern. Here we would have the opposite case. We're going to cauterize it. And what they would try to do, which they've already tried many times through other means and haven't succeeded, is to fracture Iran along its national minorities, creating a series of warlords, microstates that are easily manipulated. That is, in the north, in the Tabriz area, where the Azeris are, create an Azeri state that would have a larger population than Azerbaijan. But anyway, Azeris and so on. The Kurds, who are in Iranian Kurdistan, in the Kurdistan region. The Arabs, who are there in the area next to the Persian Gulf, Kuwait, and Iraq, well, the same thing, the Baloch too. But of course, that brings a lot of problems, because it would throw Iran into chaos and harm many others. For example, Pakistan, which has said no, 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 and Pakistan is a nuclear state, and it has a nuclear agreement with the Saudis. Whether they actually follow through is another matter. I mean, but anyway, I mean, be careful. And besides, I mean, what I'm sure of is that even the Americans, I think if the Israelis were willing to launch a nuclear weapon, they would stop them. Because what would happen? Careful. I mean, moreover, even the Chinese and the Russians must have warned about the danger and the negative consequences, I'm speaking in diplomatic terms, of using nuclear weapons against Iran.
With competition from our friendly Telegram channel, Wars and Geopolitics, here are the US military bases in the Middle East. So, how aggressive the Chinese are, Fernando. How aggressive the Chinese are. How aggressive Iran is with all these bases. Oh wait, these are the American bases.
The evil Iranians, who have this habit of getting close to US bases. It's not that the bases are being placed there. No, it's that Iran is getting closer, Russia is getting closer, everyone's getting closer. It's a joke. Just look at it.
Hence the withdrawal of troops from all these bases at this time, as a precaution, as a preventive measure by the United States, in anticipation of a possible response from Iran. Because Iran will not attack these bases without a prior US strike. This is undoubtedly a risk for the United States, the possibility of some attack against one of these countries. But the greater risk, without a doubt, is a strong response against Israel, and that Israel, caught between a rock and a hard place, with a government of supremacist lunatics, decides to use its nuclear weapons.
Claro, es que, ahí yo creo, porque nunca se sabe, pero yo creo que...
But there, I think, because you never know, but I think that, as I said, both the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians would try to say, well, look, one thing is acting like a fool and carrying out massacres in Gaza. Another thing entirely is launching a nuclear attack, because that's a whole different level since it would involve other countries. You'd be putting Pakistan in a very difficult position. And from there, Netanyahu isn't going to call Xi Jinping or Putin beforehand. No, he's not going to call. But I mean, I suppose that beforehand, some time ago, they must have warned him that Russian and Chinese interests would be extraordinarily affected, diplomatically speaking, if they ever thought of launching a nuclear weapon, and that they would have to respond in some way. I mean, it's one thing for the Russians to get along relatively well with the Israelis and make deals, like in Syria. Another thing would be if they launched a nuclear bomb against one of their main allies and broke the nuclear taboo that has been maintained since the Americans dropped the 2 bombs on Japan in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No one has used nuclear bombs since then. The problem is that what could happen is a nuclear escalation, one that could directly wipe out humanity. In other words, a war of everyone against everyone, with bombs flying everywhere. I suppose, I don't really know. That message was given to them a long time ago. I mean, be careful, because this already affects us. That is, the use of nuclear weapons is a taboo subject.
Esto es un tema tabú.
Sí, pero
supuestamente, pero claro.
Yes, but supposedly, of course. But I now remember Ben Gvir, Israel's Minister of the Interior, touring the prisons with Palestinian political prisoners, spitting on them and insulting them. The Minister of the Interior torturing them in front of the cameras for amusement. Well, Netanyahu, besides being a genocidal maniac,
además de un genocida, un corrupto mercenario,
a corrupt, mercenary, disgraceful man. And on the other side, Trump. But anyway, let's see, the American deep state, let's say Netanyahu, who, well, is, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and so on. These guys are some kind of crazy zealots. Netanyahu is, in quotes, more pragmatic in the sense that since he's corrupt and a thief, yes, he's willing to kill as many people as he can, but not to get himself killed, because that would be the end of Israel, you know? I mean, we're talking about how a nuclear attack would trigger an Iranian response, for example, against the Dimona nuclear plant. And that would be the end of Israel and the end of Netanyahu. Then, let's not forget that for the so-called grace of the Israelis, because, well, thanks to that they have nuclear weapons, the Dimona nuclear plant, of all facilities, is in a tiny country, that is in the Negev desert, a tiny country. If that were attacked, the radiation sure would kill the Palestinians, but it would also kill all the Israelis, including Netanyahu. Careful with playing around with these things, because they've got the bomb at home. So, I suppose that part of Netanyahu that's about survival, because he's a ruthless guy but doesn't want to get himself killed, would hold back the crazy fanatics who are ready to bring on the apocalypse. Come on, apocalypse and all that. But anyway, these are just my speculations, you know? Who knows?
Yes, Netanyahu could also decide to launch a nuclear attack from Miami. Why not? Like his son.
Also, but he's playing, he has to run now. You're going to Miami? Of course. I think what has mainly kept the Americans from going into an open war, what we saw, that negotiated or semi-negotiated intervention or whatever in the 12-day war, into an open war with Iran, is that they don't see any good options, not a single one. That is, no matter how many options start to appear, they don't see any good ones. So, that's what has held them back. First, the country's capacity. We're talking about a country with enormous capacity, with significant support, and yet it doesn't see what to do to throw Iran into chaos without the consequences of that chaos spreading throughout the entire region. It could lead to a nuclear war, and of course it's going to create an oil crisis that, yes, will greatly affect China, but also the United States, because the United States still imports oil. I mean, that could trigger a snowball effect, and they know it. They've probably run 2,000 simulations in which they don't win a single one, and everything ends up being a disaster for them as well.
Fernando, to wrap up, images of the regime's repression. This surely stirs emotions. I'll present it.
Yes.
Here, the repression by Iranian forces.
Poor protesters. There, yes, yes, yes.
Now striking, isn't it?
The chants, the songs in English, people speaking in English. Well, but it's so they can understand it since it's being broadcast, so people in other countries can understand it and all that probably. Yeah. Yeah.
Even American faces, American media. Well, let's see. The Iranians aren't exactly... Oh, Fernando. Oh, it's the United States.
Are you telling me that in the United States the police use brutal repression? Or, for example, that they shoot someone in the back almost every week? I can't believe it. I mean, please, what are you saying?
This is also in Iran here.
Yes, I see it now, I do.
I see that. Well, they're not very gentle. No.
All of this, the guy on the floor shouting, I'm not resisting. They're beating him to a pulp. And on a Sunday.
And it's true. These aren't the anti-immigration ones. They're the ones who killed a woman the other day.
The ICE, right?
This ICE one, yes.
This in Los Angeles now, huh? A while ago it was Minneapolis, now Los Angeles. Well, yeah, okay. And the repression in Iran, Fernando?
Come on, but we already know the United States is a democracy, right? I mean, they can take people out, they've got the percentage. In absolute numbers, of course, they have the largest prison population in the world, the largest, around 2 million. But it's a democracy, right? By far, sure. I mean, I don't know. At this point, jokes aside, if anyone still thinks the United States is truly a democracy, they have serious cognitive issues or an absolutely closed-off source of information. Change it. Look for us or anyone else who'll give you a different answer. Because even from an electoral standpoint, that's not a democracy. We're tested many times with elections and all that. The presidential ones, the upcoming midterms. It's a total joke. I mean, the ones with the most votes don't win there. Another thing is, let's say there are more than just suspicions, and not because Trump said so, but even before he ever ran, that the elections have been rigged in 1,001 ways, at the presidential level, in Congress, and locally. Well, at the local level, it's an even bigger joke. I mean, that system was never conceived that way. The Founding Fathers never conceived of it as a democracy. In fact, they feared it. That's why presidential elections are done with electors.
By the way, Fernando, it's almost unnecessary for us to clarify that our criticism is directed at US foreign policy, and even its domestic policy, not at the American people. We have many American friends, and all of them are appalled by all these atrocities. For example, the actor Mark Ruffalo, the other day, was protesting the murder of this woman, Renee Nicole Good, who had 3 children, a little girl, a baby, murdered in cold blood by one of those ICE thugs.
Murdered. We have a vice president who's lying about what's happening. We have we're in the middle.
We are in the middle of a war with Venezuela, which we invaded illegally. He's telling the world that international law doesn't matter. He's the worst human being. If we depend on this man's morality for the most powerful country in the world, then we're in a lot of trouble.
Then we're all in a lot of trouble.
Well, at another point, he said somewhere in that same statement that they're really ashamed of what's being done in their name. So, well, I took his words as a sign of not generalizing about ordinary people. In many ways, and to a great extent, Americans are also victims of that disgraceful Trump.
Let's see, we're talking about a population, if I remember correctly, of about 340 million people. That's like any other country. Maybe Andorra is more homogeneous. I don't know, since it's tiny. But come on, that's like saying that Russians, who are 147 million, are fewer. But while the Chinese, who are 1.4 billion, the Indians, who are 1.4 billion, think this or that. No, look, there's all kinds of people. So yes, there are people with a quick trigger in the United States, and people who oppose that.
Fernando, my dear, tomorrow Eduardo Villor and Santiago Martinez will join us to talk about the international geopolitical situation. For today, we'll wrap it up here, and our next meeting will be on Sunday, right?
Sunday, exactly. That's when we'll be able to tell whether there's been an attack or not these days, of course. People are making bets. I mean, I know this might sound very... What do you call it?
Bets, huh?
Pools, shamanic ones? Yes, bets. Although it may seem very frivolous to make pools about a war. But guys, that's how it is. We're not going to get all nitpicky about it now or anything. I mean, look, it's also a way to ease the tension, because if we add more tension to the situation, well, lightening things up with this kind of stuff, or with humor, well, it's beneficial. So go ahead and write down what you think. I mean, is there going to be a war in the next few days? Yes, no, and so on. For this reason, for that reason, for whatever.
Because, well, those who want to join us on Patreon, where we share what we can't show on this platform, you're all very welcome. Dearest Fernando, a hug, and see you soon.
Bye-bye. See you later. Bye.
Yeah.